Hi, I'm Lillian. Welcome back to my channel, Ink and Pages. Today I'm going to be telling you about the 8 books I read this spring. First of all, I've reread Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, and then I read for the first time Crooked Kingdom. So, Six of Crows, I read this in, 2020? I think genuinely, it was either in 2020 or 2021. I read it for the Disability Readathon in the April of whatever year it was, and I thought in no way could it possibly live up to all the hype I'd heard about it on BookTube for years and years and years, and it did, and it was incredible, and I loved it so much, and I gave it 5 stars. I've not given it 5 stars again. I've given it a 4.5, because, I mean, realistically, 4.5 stars and 5 in my brain are very similar ratings. There's almost nothing distinguishing them, apart from the fact that I didn't feel like mad, life-changing love towards this a second time. However, 4.5 is not something to turn your nose up at. And so this reread has really just solidified this book as one of my all-time favorite series, I would say. I feel like everyone knows what this is about. It's a fantasy heist, and it's set in the same world as the Shadow and Bone books. I feel like everyone on BookTube has heard about them. I feel like we've all watched the TV show and been disappointed by the second series. But that was Six of Crows. And Crooked Kingdom, obviously, book 2, the second and final book in this duology, which is still not a word I particularly like saying, it feels made up. This was another 4.5 star, which again, basically means it was a 5 star, which basically means I loved every second of it. Which actually, much like the first one, I wasn't expecting to. I really didn't think this would live up to all the incredible hype I'd heard about it, and yet it did. One thing I'd forgotten about this series, and actually I guess particularly in Six of Crows because I'd already read it, was I'd forgotten how funny it can be at times. Kaz is actually quite jokes quite often. And my favourite scenes in this series are not necessarily the high stakes action, very exciting things where the plot is moving and things are happening, although those are really fun, don't get me wrong. But my favourite scenes are the ones where it's just the 6 main characters kind of playing off each other and just having a bit of a fun time. And it's just really excellent. I had seen the spoilers for this book. I knew it was going to happen in that chapter. And I didn't think it was going to get to me as much as it did. Because when I read the spoiler, my initial reaction was kind of like, okay, that sucks, I guess. But actually, when I got to that moment in the book, I genuinely teared up, which I did not think it was going to be able to make me do. But I think even though I knew this moment was coming, it was built up to and written so beautifully that I was like, yeah, okay, you got me. However, there was another happier moment, definitely, towards the end of this book, which I was in no way spoiled on. Somehow, miraculously did not hear of this in advance. And it was so lovely that I cried at that as well. So it was just a really fun time. It's just a great book. It's a great series. I am now on the hype train. I'm driving the hype train. Everyone should read this. You should read it, especially Crooked Kingdom, actually, before watching the second series of the TV show, because yes, the second series wasn't as good as the first one, felt very like a Frankenstein's monster of the books, and they really stole a lot of the emotional, impactful moments from Crooked Kingdom in particular, and slotted them in at points where the emotional context was not there and they didn't hit as hard. And I think I watched the first 4 episodes of series 2 before reading this book, and even in the first third of this book, I was going, wait, I remember that scene from seeing it in Shadow and Bone, and I really didn't think they would steal scenes from here and put them in the show, because it just wouldn't work. And guess what? It didn't really work. It was kind of an okay moment in the TV show, and then I read those scenes how they should have been in this book, and I'm like, wow, that's so much better. I don't know why they did that to it. So really, thank God I finished this when I did, because I could have unknowingly spoiled a lot of it for myself by just watching series 2 of the show. But yeah, it was really good. I loved it. Next, I read The Gathering Dark by Tori Bovalino. This is an anthology of folk horror, it says. I would argue this is really more of a paranormal contemporary anthology, which was my first stumbling block with this. I was like, I don't really like horror, but I feel like I could appreciate some short, spooky horror stories. So I was like, let's pick up a whole anthology of them and see what we get. It was a mixed bag. It was unfortunately a generally not very good mixed bag. Of the 10 stories in here, 4 of them I gave a 3-star or above, so like it was definitely more on the disappointing side, and a lot of that had to do with, I don't think this is the genre it's pretending to be. First of all, kind of unrelated, this is YA. I didn't think it would be, I wasn't looking for that. Nowhere on this does it say YA. Maybe I should have guessed if I'd looked at the list of authors, but I've actually never read from any of these authors before. I recognize, I think, 2 of the names on here. I knew of Chloe Gong and Hannah Witten, but maybe they're like famous YA authors, I don't know. I didn't put that together, so I was kind of disappointed to be like, oh, why am I reading about teenagers? I don't love to read about teenagers, and I especially don't love to read about teenagers in our world, in our contemporary world, with, I would say, more contemporary paranormal elements than actual horror elements, and especially folk horror. I was like, ooh, what's folk horror? It makes me think of like medieval villages and witches and demons, and it makes me think of like historical pastoral settings. And this was, I think, apart from like 1, maybe 2 of the stories that I can't remember, all set in present day. And immediately I was like, okay, so this isn't really folk horror. I would say maybe like 2 of these stories, even though they were set in present day, I would kind of count as folk horror, but like that's scraping the barrel. So this really set me off on the wrong foot because it's not the genre I thought it was, or that it claims to be. So I think if you do want to read this, just bear in mind that it is more set in our world than the subtitle, An Anthology of Folk Horror, would suggest. In terms of enjoying the stories anyway, or like despite the fact that I wouldn't class them as folk horror, that's more of a me problem because I don't like that kind of story. In the other anthologies I've read, which are like all science fiction and all fantasy, again, there's a very clear distinction between the stories I did enjoy more, which are the ones which are set in fantasy worlds or like, just in other worlds, and then the ones which were set in our modern world, but with like maybe a bit of a sci-fi twist or a fantasy twist or a paranormal twist in this case. I really don't enjoy them as much. They're not what I'm reading about. I don't reach for contemporary and literary fiction books as often as I reach for high fantasy. That's just my personal preference. So I think maybe someone else who picks this up thinking it was folk horror could still enjoy it because they also enjoy contemporary and paranormal stories, but unfortunately that was just really not the case for me. I'm torn on whether I'm going to keep this. I think I will keep it because, again, 4 of the stories I liked. My favorite one was the one about like a ghost. Oh, I've put this back in upside down. Look at that. I've put the dust cover's the right way up, the book's upside down inside. I'll fix that in a minute. My favorite story in here was about like a ghost by a lake. What was it called? It was called Ghost on the Shore. It was by Alison Saft. That was my favorite one. That one I would definitely say felt folk horror-y, even though it was set in our contemporary world. So previously I've used anthologies as kind of like a taste test for the authors to see if I want to read from any of them again. Alison Saft potentially, but I hadn't heard of her, so I don't know what else she's written. There was one story in here that I like really didn't like. Let me check my notes. It was the one by the editor. I'm so sorry, Tori Bovalino. It was called Loved by All Save One. Really, really didn't like that story. And actually, I feel like the same thing happened with, what's the name of that anthology I read last year? 1,000 Beginnings and Endings, where again, it was the editor was a contributing author for it, and her story I like really didn't like. So yeah, mixed thoughts, mixed feelings, mixed bag. I'm giving this overall as an anthology like a 2.5, which isn't fantastic by any means. Yeah, I don't have anything else to say. Next, I read a book almost immediately after buying it, which was very exciting. I bought this in the Waterstones in Newport on the Isle of Wight on my family holiday, and it is Medusa by Jessie Burton. This had a pro and a con immediately for me. Con was, I've read from Jessie Burton before. I read The Miniaturist. when it was like really popular, what, like 10 years ago? And I absolutely did not get it. I read it and I was like, I'm missing something, because I thought this book was rubbish and really boring and nothing happened and nothing like really made sense, but everybody fucking loved it. And I really was like, I've missed something. What has happened? So the Jessie Burton on the title was kind of working against this book for me. However, Medusa was very much working for me. This is now the third book I've read where it is a retelling of a Greek mythology character, and it's just her name as the title. I have previously read Circe, which I gave 5 stars. I've read Ariadne, which I gave 1 star. I've now read Medusa, which I gave 3 stars. So we're knocking them off. We've got a full spectrum of Greek mythology retellings with the female character's name as the title. And yeah, it was good. It wasn't fantastic, but it was interesting, and I appreciated it because it did something different, and it did something like a bit unexpected and interesting. And that is what Ariadne was missing for me, because it was just like I could have read the Wikipedia page of Ariadne's story and had the same experience as reading a 400-page book about her, and then the ending was just like, what the fuck was that ending? I won't go on about it. This was interesting because it does like put I hate the phrase fresh spin, but it puts a fresh spin on the story of Medusa, and it was like emotional and touching at points, and then also at points like makes you very angry, because actually the story of Medusa should make you very angry, and I thought it was actually very well told in this. One writing choice that didn't gel with me incredibly well was it's written in some places, it's written very well, I would say in general, first of all, but it sometimes mixes quite old-fashioned ways of speaking with like phrases and terms and bits of dialogue that felt very modern. And I was like, I feel like this is a choice by the author to maybe show that these characters, even though they're from stories from like thousands of years ago, are still applicable to the modern era, and there's people like them out there still. I think I get that. However, it did feel quite jarring to read at moments, but I really liked what it had to say. Again, Medusa's story is told very well, and it had a lot to say in this book about victim blaming, and that's like partially what I think should make you so angry when you read it, but it's always challenged on the page. Actually, at no point do people get away with that kind of stuff. Like, it's very always presented as like, no, don't do that, he's in the wrong, obviously. So yeah, I've given this 3 stars. I think it was actually pretty good, and I would recommend it for people interested in reading about Greek mythology. Maybe not as your first stop to reading about Medusa. Like, if you've literally never heard of Medusa, don't read this first. Like, read the actual story first. I don't know, read the Wikipedia page and then come and read this. I think that would work really well. It's also very, very short, which I wasn't expecting when I picked it up. But yeah, I would recommend it. After that, I actually read some non-fiction. How exciting. I read Babel by Gaston de Rennes. This is all about languages. Specifically, it is about the 20 most spoken languages in the world, and then there's a chapter on each of them. What are the 20 most spoken languages in the world? Well, they are, I'm going to read them for you, why not? From position 20 all the way up to number 1, it is Vietnamese, Korean, Tamil, Turkish, Javanese, Persian, Punjabi, Japanese, Swahili, German. Then top 10, we have French, Malay, Russian, Portuguese, Bengali, Arabic, Hindi/Urdu, he talks about them in one chapter because they're very similar languages, Spanish, Mandarin, and English. So yeah, there's a chapter on each of them, and he focuses on a different element of each of the languages. So it's not like one overview chapter where he talks about very similar aspects, like a top trumps card of each language. It's not like that. There is something unique and interesting about each chapter, and it was really, really interesting. I mean, a book about 20 different languages sounds like it would be maybe quite intense and even a little bit overwhelming with all of the information you imagine is going to be thrown at you. But actually the chapters, I don't know if they were pretty short, but they felt really short and interesting. And like, I would say this was fast paced. Even though it's a non-fiction, it's as fast-paced as I feel like a non-fiction can be. And you really would finish a chapter and then be like, oh, I really want to read the next one. So I just think it was really, really good. And if you like languages or linguistics or history or culture or geography even, I would really recommend you pick this up. I bought this on a bookshop call with my sister pre-COVID. Literally, it was January 2020, and we went to like 5 different bookshops in London, like central London. Where did I get this? Oh, that was a good question. I feel like I might have got it from the big Waterstones on, oh my god, Piccadilly. I think it was that one, like, you know, the big famous one. They're always like, this is the biggest bookshop in Europe if you count it in a certain way. I think I got it there. So it really has been languishing on my shelves for almost 3.5 years. And I was always like, one day I'm gonna come back for you, because I actually started reading this maybe last year and read the first like bit of the first chapter and was like, yeah, that's interesting, but not right now. It is this book's time now, and I read it and it was really, really good. The one misstep in this book was, I think, the chapter of Arabic. So each of the chapters is very interesting and focuses on something different. However, in the chapter on Arabic, like a large chunk of it is literally just a dictionary, in a way that I was like, I can't even pretend to read this. It's literally just an Arabic dictionary for like 8 pages. I can't find it now, classic. But that was kind of incredibly boring and I did skip it. What were the most interesting chapters? So in Punjabi, in that chapter he talks about the like tonal aspects of it. That was fun because obviously English isn't a tonal language, so I was kind of like, what is that? Javanese, that was a really fun chapter. I won't lie, I had not heard of Javanese as a language, didn't know it existed. But that was really interesting because it's talking about the formality levels and how there are literally different, is dialect the right word? I'm not sure, registers in Javanese depending on who you're talking to. And there's like 3 different ones and it's just incredibly a lot. And he talks about how even, you know, a lot of modern Javanese speakers are like kind of don't like this element of their this element of their language. So that was really cool. The Korean chapter was kind of about onomatopoeias, but it was about, what's the overall word for that? Idiophones. It was about idiophones and how Korean has a lot of them. Here's a fun fact. In English, if the Prime Minister gave a speech and talked about like, we thumped our enemies, I don't know, something like that, you'd be like, okay, thump it's not a very formal word. You wouldn't use that as a mark of being like a great orator. You know, like you wouldn't use the word like thump and wallop in Parliament really. But in Korean, it's very common to use those kind of words and it actually does mark you out as a quite like sophisticated and good speaker. So that was fun. What else was cool? In the Japanese chapter, he talks about how the language of Japanese men and Japanese women and how it's like very, in some places, very obviously divided down the gender lines. That was very interesting because I'd literally never heard of that. The German chapter, so I speak German, that's the only language here I could really actually claim to speak. That was all about how statistically rare like German is as a language and its different elements and how they actually don't show up in other world languages that often. So yeah, it's just like a really interesting book. And I would read like a chapter of it or so on my way to or from work every day and then just be like, hey, can I tell you a fun fact about Portuguese? Hey, did you know this about Urdu? Like, it was a great time. I had a really good time reading it. I think I'm gonna give this 3.5 stars because it was good and parts of it were really good. And that's literally what a 3.5 star means to me. Next I read one of my favorite books ever, it turns out. So I first read this book in 2015. It was one of the first books I read because I heard about it on BookTube and I gave it 5 stars in 2015 and it has been on my like Goodreads favorite shelf ever since then. I've always considered it one of my favorite books of all time, but I never reread it until this year, until 2023. And I thought, what are the chances that 2015 me had amazing taste in books to the point where this is still going to be one of my favorite books of all time. I'm going to love it and want to sell my soul for it and give it 1,000,000 stars if I could. The answer is yes, that is in fact the case. And the book in question is The First 15 Lives of Harriet August by Claire North. This book is just phenomenal in literally every way, and I do feel like it was personally written for me and me alone, and it was designed to just fit into my brain and suit my neural pathways in a way that I alone can perfectly absorb and digest and adore it. So this book is about a man called Harry August, as you could guess, who is born in, I think, 1918 and lives his life and dies, and then is born in 1918 and then lives and then dies and then is born in 1918. And so basically every time he dies, he is born again in exactly the same scenario, in the same situation. And by the time he's like 4, his memories of his previous lives have come back to him, and he can make different choices and do different things with his life. But whenever he dies, he is born again in exactly the same place. And Claire North is just so good at doing this thing where she comes up with such a really, really cool idea like that, and then just thinks about it in every detail and does all of the nitty gritty, you know, what if this, what if that, how does this work, what if there was someone else with this power, like what if there were lots of people, how would it work, how would they fit together, what would it mean? And I fucking loved it. It's so good and it's so clever. And it's so emotional in parts, like I don't want to say, but I was like bamboozled by how much I love this book. Yes, okay, maybe in a few chapters there's some slightly too heavy physical, philosophical, philosophizing and discussions that like maybe did lose me for a couple of pages, but it's integral to the book, and obviously you don't have to understand it that much to enjoy the book, because I did not, but I just love it. I just love this book. This is a 5-star forever and always. This gives me like crazy love towards it in a way that only a 5-star can achieve. And that does make it the first 5-star of this year, and it's a reread. And I'm not gonna say it's just a reread, because rereads are often the best things I read because they're really good, because that's why I'm reading them again. So this was fantastic and I loved it, and it was amazing and I loved it, and it was so clever and interesting and intriguing, and I loved it, and I will love it forever. Finally, or I guess penultimately, I read In an Absent Dream by Shauna Maguire. This is in her Wayward Children series about children who have gone through magical doors into magical fantasy worlds, had an adventure, loved it, wanted to stay, but then for some reason had to come back into our world. So every other book in the series, the Even books, follow a child in their fantasy world. So it's kind of like a little prequel, or it's like the entire book is a flashback to one of these adventures. In this one, we follow a character who goes to the Goblin Market, which is, like it sounds, a market with lots of fantastical people and things. And it's all about fair value and exchange and fairness and logic. And it was a really, really cool world to read about. And I did actually really like this book. I only gave it like I only gave it 3 stars. That's good. Do I want to bump it up to a 3.5 in hindsight? Potentially, because there were some bits in it I really, really did like. It touches a lot on on family and friendships, and it was playing at certain points all the right bittersweet heartstrings that would normally get me very emotional. And I did get kind of emotional towards the end of it, I won't lie. Like, not hugely, no tears were shed, but they were considered. And the ending is kind of, because we've met this character in a previous book, we kind of know the end of the story, because again, this is like a prequel. It flashes back to their time as a child and when they got to go to their world. And so like you kind of know that it's going to end a little bit tragically and like not well. But yeah, it did kind of get to me. And I've heard that this is quite a lot of people's favorite book in the series. It's not mine. I think I still like the first book in this series the most, but I can absolutely understand why this would be. Again, I really like stories about people in fantasy worlds or going to fantasy worlds and having a fantastical time in a world which is not our own. So I do like the Even books in this series. I mean, I've read 2 of them, but they've both been solidly good, where we are following the characters going into their worlds and hearing about those stories. Every other book, so the odd numbered books in this series, for example, book number 5 in this series, which I also read, it's called Come Tumbling Down. This is more following the current storyline, I guess. So we're so the characters have already gone to their worlds and come back, and then we're sort of picking up from there. I, unfortunately, am realizing I don't really like the odd numbered books in this series, apart from the first one, and I think I know why. The very first book in this series introduces us to the concept of it. It introduces us to the school where these children go to try and deal with their experiences. It's called Eleanor West's Home for Wayward Children. Eleanor West is clearly not fit to run a school, I will say. But the first book it's all set in the school. There's an exciting story that happens set in the school, and it just really works for me as a concept. The third book and the fifth book in this series don't. And I think it's because they feel muddled, they feel unnecessary, and the fact that in the third and the fifth one, characters do get to go and travel to different fantasy worlds, I think it really waters down the impact of the fantasy worlds. And like, they're always talking about how they had a great adventure and it's so unlikely that they're ever going to be able to go back to their worlds, that in the third and the fifth book, when they're just like a group of them are like, yeah, let's go into this like other fantasy world to do this mission or this quest or this to save someone, etc., it just doesn't have the impact and it doesn't work for me. This felt like it was trying to do a million things at once, none of them very well. And it's a shame because we get to re-meet some characters in here that I really liked. And I didn't know what this book was about until like a minute before I started reading it, because I bought it because it's the one in the series. And I'm like, yeah, I'm committed to reading this series. And I bought it and I didn't really read the blurb. And then I read the blurb just before I picked it up and I went, oh my God, it's about these characters. And then I went, oh, I actually really liked those characters. Do I want to read about them in the context of an odd book in the series? Because I'd already kind of guessed that I wasn't going to enjoy it for all the reasons I've just said. And sadly, I really don't think this book should exist. The characters that I really liked and was kind of excited at first to read about again, I don't think it does them justice, but it feels very tacked on. Their story really worked in the two books they've already appeared in, and this felt very anticlimactic. It felt very unnecessary. There were also lots of moments, not just involving these like favorite characters of mine, but other ones where they'd have like an emotional thing happen and then like it'd be undone like a page later, and I was like, I really don't understand why we're trying to pretend that any of this matters or is a big deal, because I don't think it is. It's just not satisfying, and that I think was my main issue. I'm gonna give this 2 stars, but that is a reluctantly given 2 stars, and maybe it feels more like a 1.5. I have ideas for what this book could have been about. It could have been like another mystery. You could have had, here's a pitch, you could have had the characters in Eleanor West's school, and then they could have been like a new character, and then you think that they have returned from a fantasy world when actually they're from another fantasy world, and this world, our world, is their fantasy adventure. That could have been fun. Maybe she'll do that in a later book, I don't know. But I do think that I'm gonna have to sort of slog through these odd books in the series to actually enjoy the even books. I'm really hoping another book will prove me wrong. I think at one point in like, I don't know, book 7, 9, further on this series, there's another school we learn about where it's for children who had a terrible time in their fantasy world and don't want to go back, unlike the children in Eleanor West's school. So like that could be interesting, because again, that promises a more self-contained and interesting and standalone adventure. And I'm not really interested in reading about these characters just sort of running around and like doing things in other people's worlds in a way that to me doesn't really matter. So that was quite a negative point to end this video on. I did overall really enjoy these books. I've had a great time reading them. I've read more than I thought. I think that's my 14th book I finished of the year now, which is very exciting. So thank you so much for watching. If you've read any of these books, please tell me your thoughts on them. And I will see you in my next video.